Could you survive 4 months in a city where getting on the subway might kill you? In the fall of 1918, New York became a test of how much people could take as an invisible disease tore through crowded tenements and packed streets. This was happening in the modern world, a pandemic that spread faster than anyone could track it. Other American cities closed their schools and theaters. New York made a different choice: keep the city open, even as bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The Spanish flu killed over 33,000 New Yorkers in 4 months, more than all the city's soldiers who died in the entire World War. Morgues overflowed. Children sang rhymes about death. But the subways kept running and the theaters stayed lit. How do 8 million people get through the day when death might be in every cough, every crowded elevator, every handshake? We'll hear from telephone operators who died at their posts, undertakers who ran out of coffins, families who had to mark their tenement windows with purple cloth. We'll walk streets where ambulance bells drowned out normal city noise and look at the decisions that maybe saved New York, or made everything worse. This is what happened when the world's most connected city faced a disease that isolated everyone and the city refused to shut down. The summer of 1918 belonged to the war. Charlie Chaplin stood on the steps of the New York Public Library, selling Liberty bonds to cheering crowds while doughboys marched down Fifth Avenue toward the harbor. Newspaper headlines screamed of battles in France, casualty lists, and the promise of victory. In all this patriotic noise, few New Yorkers paid attention to the scattered reports of sailors falling ill at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The city had become the beating heart of America's war machine. Every day, ships departed from its harbor carrying fresh troops to European battlefields. The newly expanded subway system packed workers into underground tubes as they rushed between munitions factories and offices, coordinating the massive logistical effort. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, immigrant families crowded into airless rooms, their sons either overseas or working in the shipyards that never stopped building. Dr. Royal S. Copeland, the city's health commissioner, embodied this wartime confidence. A charismatic homeopath who understood the power of public relations, Copeland assured reporters in early September that the city is in no danger of an epidemic. When pressed about the mysterious illness affecting dock workers, he called it a 3-day fever. Nothing that would interfere with the war effort or the vital flow of men and materials through New York's harbor. This wasn't just medical hubris. The Sedition Act had made any news that could damage wartime morale potentially criminal. Across the Atlantic, German submarines prowled shipping lanes, while Allied censors suppressed reports of a devastating illness sweeping through military camps. The pandemic got the name Spanish flu, not because it started in Spain, but because Spain's neutral press could report freely on the catastrophe, while warring nations kept quiet. By mid-September, the whispers grew harder to ignore. Sailors arriving from Boston brought more than cargo. They carried the second, deadlier wave of influenza. But the city's attention stayed fixed on the war's climactic months. Victory seemed within reach, and nothing would dim that hope. The greatest city in America had survived financial panics, labor strikes, and waves of immigration. How much danger could an invisible enemy really pose? October arrived with the sound of death moving through the city. Not the distant, noble death of battlefields that filled newspaper columns, but something immediate and terrifying that struck in tenement hallways and subway cars. The Spanish flu had learned to hunt in the world's most crowded spaces. The virus killed fast. Martha Cohen, a seamstress on Hester Street, felt fine when she left for work on a Tuesday morning. By afternoon, her lips had turned blue from lack of oxygen. She was dead before midnight, one of dozens that day whose lips and fingernails turned that bluish tint, like they were drowning in air. Fear changed the city's daily rhythms. The subway became a chamber of mutual suspicion. A single cough in a crowded car could clear an entire section as passengers pressed themselves against windows or fled at the next stop. People learned to breathe differently, shallow and careful, as if the air itself had turned hostile. Children created a jump rope rhyme that echoed through schoolyards. I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and in flew Enza. Their parents had tried to shield them from the truth, but children saw their neighbors disappear. Their teachers failed to return. their own siblings burning with fever that no amount of cooling cloths could break. The flu struck, hardest at people in their 20s and 30s, the exact demographic that should have been strongest. Pregnant women often died alongside their unborn children. This wasn't the familiar pattern of disease claiming the elderly and weak. The Spanish flu seemed to target vitality itself, turning the body's immune response into a weapon against its host. By the third week of October, Dr. Copeland could no longer maintain his reassuring tone. The daily death counts, printed in small type beneath war headlines, told their own story. What had been dozens became hundreds. The 3-day fever had become something else, a force that moved through the city's arteries of connection, following the paths that made New York the greatest city on earth. The city started coming apart in ways nobody saw coming. At Bellevue, patients were lined up on stretchers in the hallways, while doctors worked through them like they were sorting wreckage. The emergency ward had tripled its size, bleeding into armories and public schools that got turned into hospitals overnight. But people kept showing up. Telephone operators, mostly young women who spent all day connecting calls, started dying at their switchboards. The endless "number, please" that had become background noise in the city got patchy, then went silent across whole neighborhoods. Families who tried calling for a doctor or an undertaker got nothing. The city's phone system was dying one operator at a time. Entire blocks started smelling like death. New York's morgues, built to handle the usual flow, filled up in days. Coffin makers worked through the night and still couldn't keep up. In the tenements where immigrant families had been building their lives, a new signal appeared, purple or black cloth hanging from windows to mark death inside. Bodies sat on fire escapes waiting for collection wagons that showed up later each day, if they came at all. Undertaker James Murphy talked about scenes he said stuck with him for decades. We'd get to a building and find 3-4 families dead on different floors. The living had run. Sometimes you'd find kids, 8 or 9 years old maybe, taking care of younger ones because every adult in the building was gone. The city's sounds changed completely. Street vendors, car horns, construction, all of it got drowned out by ambulance bells. They rang so often people stopped reacting. You'd hear one and not even turn your head. Worse than the noise was the quiet. These moments when whole blocks seemed to go still, like talking too loud might let the thing inside. Essential workers got stuck with an ugly choice: leave and watch the city fall apart, or keep working and probably get sick. Garbage collectors, a lot of them recent immigrants with families depending on them, kept making rounds even as their co-workers vanished. Letting trash pile up in a city already drowning in corpses, nobody wanted to see that. Down in the subway tunnels, maintenance crews found strange things. Little shrines where people had left photos of the dead, empty medicine bottles on platforms, handwritten notes pinned to walls, desperate messages from people trying to reach anyone who might still be out there in a world that felt like it was dying one breath at a time. Dr. Royal Copeland made a choice that terrified half the city and puzzled the other half. Philadelphia had shut everything down after their Liberty Loan Parade killed thousands. San Francisco put masks on everyone. Copeland looked at both approaches and went the opposite direction. His reasoning: panic kills more than disease. New York would stay open, but he didn't just throw the doors wide and hope for the best. Copeland told businesses to stagger their hours, stores opening at different times, offices shifting schedules so people weren't packed into subway cars during rush hour. This sounds obvious now, but in 1918 it was strange enough that some business owners thought he'd lost his mind. Instead of emptying the subways, he tried to manage the flow of bodies through them. Schools were the real fight. Most cities closed classrooms. Copeland kept them open, and his reason was dark. Kids in tenements were crammed 6 to a room, windows that never opened, disease moving through those spaces like water through a sieve. Schools had ventilation, schools had space. Teachers checked students every morning for symptoms, basically turned into medical screeners overnight. A child is safer in school than on the street or at home, Copeland said. Parents hated hearing it, but the math was hard to argue with. Theatres could stay open if they followed rules. Better ventilation, fewer seats sold, shut down the second someone got sick. Dance halls and saloons, though? Closed. Copeland's thinking, you could track who went to a theatre. bars were just crowds of people breathing on each other in the dark, no way to know who'd been there. The Met kept performing while neighborhood bars went dark. His real tool was the newspapers. Every morning, Copeland's column ran in multiple papers. Practical advice, calm tone, the kind of voice that made you feel like someone knew what they were doing. Do not spit in public places. Avoid crowds when possible. Fresh air is your best protection. People read it like instructions for survival, because that's what it was. The Spit Spreads Death campaign went everywhere. Subway walls, shop windows, tenement hallways. Cops started fining people for spitting, which had been as common as smoking. The whole city became conscious of things it had never thought about before. Breathing near strangers, touching railings, standing too close. People said Copeland cared more about keeping businesses open than keeping people alive. Maybe that was part of it. But Philadelphia's parade had killed more Americans than some battles in France. Copeland was betting that managing the city carefully would work better than shutting it down completely, that a city still functioning could survive better than one that had stopped breathing. By December, the results would either prove him right or destroy his reputation. New York had chosen to face the virus by adapting instead of hiding. Whether that was brave or reckless depended on who you asked, and whether you were still alive to ask it. When the Spanish flu finally loosened its grip on New York in early 1919, the city that emerged wasn't the same one that had entered the fall of 1918. The numbers were grim: 33,000 dead in 4 months, life expectancy down 12 years. But those figures didn't capture the orphaned children, the shuttered shops that stayed dark, the families who had to redefine what normal meant without half their members. The forgetting started fast. Soldiers came home to parades, the jazz age cranked up, and everyone seemed eager to move on from the war and everything else that had gone wrong. No one built monuments to the telephone operators who died at their switchboards, or the undertakers who worked until they collapsed. The pandemic became something you mentioned quietly, if at all. Families remembered, but the city didn't. Still, things had changed in ways that weren't obvious. The Department of Health wasn't the same sleepy office it had been. It came out of 1918 as something closer to a command center, tracking disease across millions of people, analyzing patterns, responding faster. Those daily death counts Copeland published turned into sophisticated surveillance systems that could map outbreaks down to individual blocks. People argued for years about whether Copeland got it right. San Francisco and Milwaukee locked down hard and saw fewer deaths, but their economies tanked. Philadelphia's parade became the textbook example of what not to do. New York landed somewhere in the middle. Not the best death rate, not the worst, and that made Copeland's approach hard to judge. Maybe he saved lives, maybe he just saved his reputation. Historians still can't agree. But some of what he did stuck around. Staggered hours became a standard move during crowded emergencies. Keeping some things open while closing others became the template, and his newspaper columns, straightforward, practical, relentlessly calm even when things were falling apart, that became the model for how officials talked to the public during a crisis. The kids who sang those rhymes about Enza grew up with certain ideas baked in. They pushed for better hospitals, codes that prevented the kind of overcrowding that had turned tenements into morgues, streets that didn't trap people on top of each other. They'd learned something their parents hadn't known. Density could save you or kill. You, depending on what was moving through those crowded streets alongside the usual traffic. By the time the next big crisis hit, New York had something it didn't have in 1918. Not just memories, those fade, but systems. The work of counting cases, tracing contacts, telling people the truth even when it wasn't comforting. All that had been built into how the city operated. The public forgot the pandemic, but the machinery remembered, and that turned out to matter. The Spanish flu didn't end with a victory parade or a newspaper headline declaring triumph over disease. It faded the way fevers break in the night, leaving behind a city that had learned the hard way what it costs to be connected. New York came out of 1918 carrying contradictions it never fully resolved. The subway tunnels that had terrified people went back to moving millions to work every day. The tenement hallways where families hung purple cloth in their windows filled up again with kids playing and neighbours talking. The telephone exchanges where operators died at their posts came back online, reconnecting a city that had nearly gone silent. But something had changed. in how New Yorkers thought about what made them strong. The density that turned the city into an economic powerhouse had also turned it into perfect hunting ground for something invisible that moved through breath and touch. Every handshake, every crowded elevator, every packed theatre now held the memory of October 1918, when those same things became ways to die. Dr. Copeland's decision to keep the city open created a blueprint that outlasted him and the pandemic both. Future health commissioners would face their own impossible choices. Polio outbreaks, the early days of AIDS, crises no one saw coming, knowing that a city can't hide from disease but can't ignore it either. The Spanish flu proved that survival takes something harder than courage or caution. It takes the delicate, dangerous work of staying human when the losses pile up beyond what feels survivable. The children who sang rhymes about Enza grew up to build modern New York's public health system. They knew in their bones what their parents learned from death counts, that keeping a city running during a pandemic is both miracle and necessity. It needs thousands of small acts of collective responsibility that no law can force and no leader can promise. When we face our own invisible enemies now, we're walking where they walked. They learned that the price of connection is watching, always, and that a city willing to pay that price might survive anything. The question isn't whether these crises come again. It's whether we remember what 1918 taught New York, that our greatest vulnerability and our greatest strength are the same thing, split only by the choices we make when everything's on the line.